So thank you very much for this introduction. And first of all, I would like to warmly thank the Nautical Archaeology Society who invited me to be part of this webinar and to present Ayn Soukhna team's work here. I would also like to thank Honor Frost Foundation, who supports the seminar and who also supports our work on the field in Ayn Soukhna since 2019. Along other institutions, the French Center for Archaeology in Cairo, the French Center for National Research, Sorbonne University, and of course with the support of the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities. And I especially would like to thank our colleagues of the Suez Antiquity Inspectorate who make our work very much easier on the field. So, these past 20 years has been crucial for the understanding of the Egyptian involvement in the Red Sea networks during the pharaonic period. Our view on this very important issue has been completely changed by the discovery and excavation of a series of sites on the Egyptian Red Coast from south to north. I can of course, cite the site of Mersa Gewasis, identified by Professor Abdelmonem Sayed at the end of the 70s, but excavations there are more recent and were made by an Italo-American team led by Rodolfo Fatovic and Catherine Bard. And second site, Wadi El Jarf, excavated in 2011 under the direction of my colleague Pierre Tallet. And Ayn Soukhna, we will talk about Ayn Soukhna today, excavated since 2001. And in Sinai, the site of El Marka, excavated by Greg Mumford, and the very important survey of all the mining area in South Sinai made by Pierre Tallet and Damien Lenné, and which brought so many information about the exploitation of this very important region by the Egyptians. The Egyptians during antiquity were very familiar with the resources of the deserts around the Nile Valley, and lots of material were retrieved from these deserts, in particular turquoise and copper ore from the southern Sinai. So we know of their involvement in South Sinai since the end of Dynasty Zero, so in fact since the very beginning of the Egyptian monarchy in the Nile Valley. So we could no longer, with these new discoveries along the Red Sea, think that the Egyptians were not fine sailors. They developed very early in their history a network of not only terrestrial but also maritime tracks in order to get the raw materials they needed. So copper ore and turquoise from Sinai, incense and frankincense, obsidian and other exotic goods from the land of Punt in the southern part of the Red Sea. We'll talk a bit more about Punt later during this presentation. As I say, we know of the Egyptian presence in South Sinai since the end of Dynasty Zero, and at that time, the expedition from the Nile Valley came only by feet and with donkeys to this area. You can see the track for the beginning of the Egyptian monarchy in yellow on this map. And the first attestations of maritime expeditions to South Sinai are from the reign of Snefru, the first king of the 4th dynasty, with the foundation of the harbour of Wadi El Jarf. During most of pharaonic times, the Egyptians conformed to the system of intermittent harbours on the Red Sea coast, or more precisely of one intermittent harbour at a time, because it seems that only one was in service at a time. So I can show you this chronology of the pharaonic period, and you can see in pink here the period during which the harbour of Wadi El Jarf was used, and during the reign of Khafre, they moved from Wadi El Jarf, they just leave Wadi El Jarf for Ayn Soukhna in green here. And Ayn Soukhna was used for a long time during the Old Kingdom and during the Middle Kingdom too, and afterwards the harbour of Mersagawasi in the south, and again Ayn Soukhna during the New Kingdom. So what is this system of intermittent harbours? Why do I speak of intermittent harbours? Because these harbours were not occupied full-time, just for a few months, usually during late spring or summer, when the sailing conditions are best in the Red Sea. So during a few months, hundreds and sometimes thousands of Egyptian men left the Nile Valley to exploit turquoise on copper mines in South Sinai by order of the king. The king was not part of those expeditions, but he ordered the expedition made because there was a need of raw material, turquoise for jewelry, but most of all copper, because copper was the only metal used to make tools during this period, and they needed lots of tools. If you think about the huge work they made around the capital Memphis for the tombs of the pharaohs, for instance, so they needed lots of copper for this work. So when they needed these materials, the king sent expeditions to South Sinai. So they sent hundreds, sometimes thousands of men living in the valley and crossing the eastern desert to go to the coast. So part of them will stay in the logistical platform formed by the Red Sea harbors, first Wadi el-Jarf, then Ayn Soukhna. And so these harbors was a place where all members of the team would come at first, assemble the boats, and prepare for the trip to Sinai. The boats were built in the Nile valleys and dismantled for the trip in the desert and reassembled in the Red Sea shore in Wadi el-Jarf first and afterwards in Ayn Soukhna. So then the main part of the group will go by feet and with donkeys to the mining area, rounding the Gulf of Suez, while the head of the team and the heavy material were transported by boat. So during the expeditions, small teams would travel from the valley to Ayn Soukhna and then by boat from Ayn Soukhna to South Sinai in order to bring food to the miners and come back with turquoise and copper ore. So you can imagine this going on from small teams during the 2, maybe 3 months of the expeditions. So by boat, it's a 55 nautical miles trip. So maybe 14 to 18 hours to go there, maybe a bit more to go north when they came back. So it was really feasible, and you can always, when the weather is good, see the Sinai from the other part of the Red Sea. So Ayn Soukhna in the system is a harbour, a logistical platform, and a key site for this network during all the pharaonic period. As I said, the site and harbour of Wadi el-Jarf, the first known pharaonic harbour on the Red Sea coast, was very densely occupied, but for a very short span of time, the reigns of Snefru and his son Hofu. The harbour of Mersagawasi was used during the Middle Kingdom. On the contrary, Ayn Soukhna is sporadically but regularly occupied throughout a very long span of time, Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, and then the site was regularly passed by during the Greek, Coptic, Islamic periods. We even know of a few monks from the nearby monasteries of St. Paul and St. Antoine who lived there as eremites. Bedouins left some graffiti, in particular camels on the rocks. So a very, very long occupation of the site, sporadic, but on a very long span of time. The site was perhaps even occupied during the pre-dynastic period, so that's the very beginning of the Egyptian monarchy in Egypt, since we have a few fragments of hard stone vessels typical of the first dynasties scattered over the site, and possibly some hearths on one point of the site dated from this period by c. 14. So this very long occupation of the site is not such a surprise because, as we'll see later, Ayn Soukhna has a lot of assets for harbour. So a few words about the history of the exploration of the site. Ayn Soukhna was rediscovered by Professor Mahmoud Abdelrazik, who sadly passed away last year. He was a professor at the Suez Canal University, and he began to work there with my colleagues from the IFAO and Sorbonne University, Georges Castel and Pierre Tallet, in 1999. So they organized a joint archaeological mission of the French and Egyptian to first collect, copy, translate, study the inscriptions, the rock inscriptions, which signaled the site. So you can see here the mountains not far from the sea. And at the beginning, there was nothing visible, no archaeological structures visible, but it was just this big panel of rock inscriptions, which is a sort of summary of the history of the site, because you can see the Middle Kingdom here, the New Kingdom, Greek inscription, Coptic inscriptions, inscriptions from the English pilots of the Canal of Suez during the 50s. So sort of, yeah, a summary of the history of the site on this only panel. And so they made a survey of the site after studying this panel of rock inscriptions, and began the excavation in 2001. So it's more than 20 years now. So we make every year a mission, usually between mid-January and the end of February. This year was a bit different because I'm just back from the field from since 1 week. So I will give you some very, very fresh news from our excavations. So as Mark said, I joined myself the team in 2011. So let's go back to the location of the settlements. I spoke earlier of its many assets. Ayn Soukhna is located some 120 kilometers east of the Memphite region, so it could be reached easily from the capital city by the desert tracks following the wadis. And it is some 50 kilometers south of Suez, along the west coast of the Gulf of Suez. It is at the foot, as you can see, of the Galala El Bahariya mountains, which overlook the site at an altitude of 580 meters. Near the site, you have the site here on this Google view. Near the site is a hot water spring. The site was named after it in Arabic because Ayn Soukhna is a hot spring if you translate it from Arabic. Hot spring with a little oasis. We ignore the extent of this oasis during the antiquity, and now with new hotels and villas being built on the site, this study will definitely be impossible, and the spring has almost disappeared. The Bay of Ayn Soukhna is a sheltered anchorage, and the mountains above the site constitute a sea mark for the sailors. The conditions would have been quite the same during antiquity, since a geomorphologist, Jean-Pierre Polvast, studied the site a few years ago and concluded that there was no significant variation of the shoreline since the pharaonic period. As you can see, the shore is not far from the mountain where the storage galleries are dug. It's like 400 meters, 500 maximum. So it's very convenient because as we will see, there is some storage galleries dug in the foot of the mountains to store heavy materials in between two expeditions. So proximity between the mountains and the shore, easy access to water. It's 600-700 meters from the site. Very convenient cove with not too much wind. So that's why they keep going to Ayn Soukhna, because it's a more convenient site they found on the Red Sea during this period. The site itself measures around 500 meters by 300 meters, and we divide it for purpose of study in two main parts. So the upper part and the lower part of the site. I say we divide it now because as you can see here, the site is now cut from the shore by a hotel which was built a few years before the beginning of the excavation. The road, and between the upper and lower part of the site there is gas pipes and water pipes and electric lines, so it's not really possible to excavate this middle part of the site. But with what we have to excavate, we have lots of work to do, and we did lots of great discoveries. So yeah, better than nothing. But what is a pity is to have lost the connection with the direct connection with the sea. We will see more of that during the presentation. So just a few views of the site during the excavation. Here you can see the mountains, and the galleries are here in the mountains. And yeah, so you can see the striking features of the site, which are the mountains, the Galala al-Bahriya mountains, and the site as it is now, with a panoramic view with my phone, so it's a bit distorted, but yeah, it can give you an idea. Okay, so in these two parts we have different kind of features. In the upper part of the site, if I come back to the plan of the site, we have 10 galleries dug in the mountains, and where disassembled boats, jars and other equipment were stored in between two expeditions. These galleries are located 40 meters above the sea level, and so some 500 meters from the shore. It was a very, very daunting task to excavate these galleries. The excavation is over now since 2013, and my colleagues Pierre Tell and Georges Castel did that so a few years ago. A daunting task because the rock here is sandstones, and it's a very fragile rock. And the sandstones that constitute the ceiling of the gallery is very fragile and collapsed already during antiquity. So they had to put scaffolding every meter to prop up the ceiling. So it was a really difficult task. The lower area of the site, where most of the activity took place during an expedition in antiquity, is where we're excavating now. There was the harbour itself, lost now under the asphalt road and the hotel, and dwellings, storehouses, workshops, cooking areas from the Old Kingdom and the early Middle Kingdom, when the occupation of the site was at its maximum spatial extension. So what we try to understand since more than 20 years now with this excavation is, first, of course, to understand the function of the site and how it works. It was to gather more information about the relationship between Egyptians and the sea, to draw the pharaonic network in the Red Sea, to understand the organization of state-planned expeditions. Because, of course, these expeditions were grand venture organized by the states. And very striking thing is that during the so-called intermediate period in the Egyptian usual chronology, we designate under this label the periods where there was not one and only monarchy in the Nile Valley, but different competing powers. And during these periods, the monarchy usually didn't had the means to organize these expeditions to South Sinai. So that's why, for instance, we have expeditions during the Old Kingdom, but not during the first intermediate period. And as soon as the monarchy was strong again at the beginning of the Middle Kingdom, they organized again these expeditions to South Sinai. So how these expeditions were organized, that was one of our main points. And we try also to understand the daily lives of the Egyptian teams, how a group of Egyptians from the Nile Valley, teams of men only, reacted outside of their usual environments. How did they adapt when they have to live for a few months in marginal areas? And a great part of our work is, at last, about technical issues, both, of course, but also copper, because this is the most important site for the Middle Kingdom period to understand copper processing in Egypt. So I will proceed chronologically. I will begin with the Old Kingdom, and then we will see the Middle Kingdom. That's the two main period of occupation of the site. So the Old Kingdom. I'll begin with the beginning of the excavation on the site, that's to say the galleries in the upper part of the site. So 10 galleries were excavated by the Egyptian during antiquity, during the Old Kingdom, between the 4th and maybe the 5th dynasty. 10 galleries in different groups. As you can see, they are in green on this plan. And as you can see, the entrance of 3 of them was even monitored with this building from the 4th dynasty to guard more, in a more efficient manner, the entrance of the galleries during the expedition, at least, because there was no one left on the site in between 2 expeditions. And just to say that this part of the site is already published in Ayn Soukhna 3 and 4, published at the French Institute in Cairo, and the last volume just was published at the end during 2020. So the archaeological reports and all the material from these storage galleries. So as you can see at the beginning of the excavation of this gallery, most part of it was just filled with, of course, archaeological layers, but too with sand coming from the wind and from water, and from the collapse of the ceilings of some of them. And one of them at the end of the excavation, these galleries are usually between 15 and 20 meters long, and a man can stand in it. And you can see all the scaffolding necessary to ensure the security of the excavators. So they were used, these galleries, to store heavy materials in between 2 expeditions, so they didn't have to carry everything once again to the valley after the expeditions. You can just retrieve this material during the next expedition. So for instance, in Gallery J5, we had dozens of pottery from the Old Kingdom. You can see them drawn on the map, on the plan here, or a few photographs from the inside of the galleries. And at the entrance of some of them, we had some inscriptions, hieratic inscriptions. So that is to say, I just lost my words. It's a shorter version of hieroglyphs used for administrative purposes usually. And these inscriptions were just painted at the entrance of some of the galleries. And my colleague Pierre Tallet made a great work of just reassemble this sort of jigsaw puzzles, because this was painted on a layer of plaster, and of course the plaster collapsed from the rock since antiquity, and so there was just little pieces of this inscription. So he made a great work in order to understand this text, which give lots of information. For instance, in here, we have the date of one of the expeditions during the reign of the 5th dynasty king Djedkare-Izezi. And it said that the mission was accomplished under the supervision of an overseer of the troop named Sadahotep, and that the expedition was going to the terrace of the turquoise, which is the Egyptian name for South Sinai. So it's perfectly clear what the goals of the expedition were with these inscriptions. And of course, they give also the names of some of the heads of the expedition, of some part of the expedition, for instance, overseer of troops, admirals, transport officer, rower, crews. So lots of information for us to understand the organization of these expeditions. So after the galleries for the Old Kingdom, I want to go down to the settlement itself in the lower part of the site. And as you can see here, we have all the structures that were excavated from the Old Kingdom, so different phases. We have 3 or 4 phases of remains for the Old Kingdom. And I can give maybe a few characteristics common to both Old and Middle Kingdom structures. What we can say is that the Egyptians admirably took advantage of the environment and of the potentiality offered by the topography of the site. The buildings were made with the local sandstones and not in mud brick, as usual in the Nile Valley, because in the Nile Valley, most of the settlements are just in mud bricks. Here, not a lot of mud, so they used the sandstones from the mountain, which is very abundant. The bedrock was often a wort, cut, dug to do fireplaces, storage pits, pits to cushion jars, and so on. I will show you a few pictures afterwards. A number of buildings were leaned against the cliff. As you can see here, we have this cliff, which is 2 or 3 meters high, and they use it to lean the buildings in order to avoid building a fourth wall, for instance. Just show you a few photos. So you can see Old Kingdom artisanal areas here against this cliff, as you can see. And as I said, they just use it for making a seat in here, storage here, storage to here. So they use this sandstone promontory for very rough installations, because they were just there for a few months, so they didn't bother to, for most of the building, to build something very strong. We have a few better built buildings for the Old Kingdom, as you can see on the plan here on COM 14 or here in area ACE 21, but it's just the exceptions, and most of the older structures are not so well built, which only makes sense because they were there just for, as I say, a few weeks every, I don't know, maybe not every year. So. And they used to a hard concretion rock layer, which sort of overhung above the cliff, because it's much more solid than sandstone. So usually the erosion is not working at the same pace, and you have this sort of natural shelter, and they use that. And they use this this layer as a roof, in fact, above installations. We have an example from the Old Kingdom in here. I would like to say now a few more words about maybe some harbour facilities that were excavated in this lower area. You can see them in pink in here and in here. I will begin with what was excavated in COM 14 area by my colleague Gregory Marois a few years ago. You can yes, in here, something dug on the bedrock underneath the Middle Kingdom structures, and then completely excavated on the right of your screen. So this feature is 17.5 meter long, 2 meter large, 2.3 meter depth as its maximum, and it has the shape of a boat, in fact. So it seems that it was used maybe to reassemble boats, so to do some work on the boats during the expeditions. We have similar features on the Pyramid Plateau near Memphis, near the huge funerary complexes of the Egyptian kings during the Old Kingdom. You have this pit rectangular with disassembled boats from the time of Khufu, but you have some of the pits dug in the bedrock and with a form which is not very far from what we have in Ayn Soukhna. So what we have in Ayn Soukhna, in fact, is the only example of that in a very in a non-funerary context, so in a real use condition. So no parallel other than these funerary examples, and as you can see, there is holes in the bedrock, maybe to insert some rod or some wood, maybe to help for reconstruct the boat. So that's one of our hypotheses for that. But obviously, it's related to boats and it's related to the harbour facilities. A few years ago, we excavated another of maybe these harbour facilities from the Old Kingdom, maybe the 4th dynasty, the end of the 4th dynasty. As you can see here, we have 2 pits dug in the bedrock and a sort of water system in here, maybe a water pipe. I put some cups so you get them better on the photo, on the picture. So as you can see, the use of the pipe and this feature on the bedrock are parallels. Definitely this is a water pipe because we have 9 small basins and a system to let water run between the only thing is that we have no parallel of that anywhere else in it. We example so no example of it by the and the fact that it's related to water. We think it's related to harbour facilities. Think some points they would have needed some basins like that to push water and maybe to really for the boat to reassemble the boat because pieces for the boat because those pieces were stored in the galleries sometimes for a few years, and maybe they have to reshape them in order to reassemble the boat. So that's one of the hypotheses, but we cannot really be certain of the function of this feature. What we know also about boats related to Ayn Soukhna, we have mentions of boats on some of the inscriptions. We have the titles of some of the staff. We have titles for carpenters on men binding boats and sailors. We have a hieratic inscription, for instance, mentioning an inspector of the carpenters, or seal impressions from the beginning of the 6th dynasty, mentioning those who assemble the king's boat. So definitely the work with boats was one of the main purpose of the settlements in Ayn Soukhna during the Old Kingdom. And what about their relationship to the sea during this period. We found large shell deposits. Obviously, they eat some shells. Lots of Neritidae, for instance, or giant clam too. And that's funny because they reuse those giant clams afterwards, even in walls, to build walls. So we have lots of them on the field there in Ayn Soukhna. Either during the Old Kingdom and the Old Middle Kingdom. But I had this feeling this year in the field that there was more curiosity about things related to the sea during the Old Kingdom. I have to work, obviously, on this first impression and add figures to this hypothesis, but we find more shells and of more different sorts in Old Kingdom layers than in early Middle Kingdom layers, for instance. I even found this year, neatly stored in a pit, with some pottery, a piece of coral, and those 5 sea urchins, as you can see on the photo, on the picture, in the PowerPoint presentation. And so this storage pits were made at the end of the expedition to store some things. Maybe they had the idea that they will retrieve them during the next expedition, and it was never retrieved because it was covered by sand, or I don't know why exactly. And in this pit, yes, we had pottery, we had a few shells, coral, and the sea urchins. And usually we find little pieces of sea urchins, but not this sea urchins really well preserved like that. So obviously they took care of the storage of that, and they of course didn't needed that for work. So maybe it was part of sort of collection on the side. I don't know. We are reduced to hypothesis, of course. In 2019, we found also this really cute little stela from the Old Kingdom, from the reign of Djedkarizazi at the end of the 5th dynasty. So we have one of the members of the expedition at that time, Senen Idu, a scribe, represented with his wife and his son here. And with their titles and names. And you cannot see them very clearly on the main photograph, but we saw them more clearly with playing with techniques, with new software now. And we have a text about the expedition he was part of on the left side of this stela. And the text mentions the name of one boat, one of these boats making the trip back and forth between Ayn Soukhna and the South Sinai mining area in order to give some food to the miners, Egyptian teams working there for a few months. And this guy, Senen Idu, is not a new guy for us, because we know him from other inscriptions in South Sinai. So the relationship is very clear between Ayn Soukhna and those mining sites in Wadi Mahara, for instance, where he's represented again with his wife and child. Which is strange, because usually they are not represented with their families. They were not in the expedition with their family. It's just a mean for him to commemorate, to celebrate his family. As I said, a few of his inscriptions mentioned boats. For instance, in this inscription, cabinet boats, that is to say, boats from Byblos, because maybe they were made from cedar wood from the Lebanese region. And that type of boat is usually mentioned in relations to expeditions to the land of Punt, which was somewhere, lots of discussion about that, on the southern end of the Red Sea, and the Egyptian went there since at least the reign of Saouré, the first mention in Egyptian text, around 2490 BC. They went there to retrieve incense, that's a main product of Punt, and some other luxury goods, as electrum, for instance. And we have this text from Pépinard Teke biography in Aswan, so in the southern frontier, southern border of Egypt at that time, and relating this episode because this Pépinard Teke, who was a chief of expeditions, was sent by the king to retrieve the body of another chief of expeditions who died because his expedition was attacked by Bedouins of this time in this area and killed, and he was there, as the text say, assembling boat to travel to Punt, to the south of the Red Sea. So we can very well imagine that this episode was happening in Ayn Soukhna, because till now that's the only harbour we know of on the Red Sea coast for this period of the 6th dynasty. And we have some other indications from relationship to Punt, because we found a few years ago this shard of pottery, very strange. It's not Nubian, it's not from the Levantine region, it's not Egyptian, so we think that maybe it's from the southern end of the Red Sea, but the culture there during the Bronze period is very, very badly known because of course, political conditions in this region since the beginning of the 20th century. So, and we find two obsidian, maybe coming from the southern Red Sea too. We know of obsidians in Yemen and in Eritrea, for instance. So lots of indications. I finish now with the Middle Kingdom site. So from the early Middle Kingdom, Ayn Soukhna was occupied again after this period of interruption of the expeditions during the first intermediate period. So at the beginning of the second millennia BC, they came back to Ayn Soukhna from the reign of Mentuhotep IV. And with 3,000 men during this reign, with 4,000 men during the reign of his successor Amenemhat I, so big expeditions at that time too, and they reoccupied the galleries at the beginning of the Middle Kingdom and at the end of the 12th dynasty too. And one of the most striking features of these galleries is that my colleagues found in two of them, J2 and J9, remains of charred boats. So that's one of the most remarkable features of the site. So you can see what happened when they began to excavate the galleries. So the ceiling just collapsed over these charred remains. You can see here the remains of the collapsing of the ceiling of the gallery, and appearing underneath the charred remains of boats. And so you can see, for instance, in gallery J9, they are still there now, and lots of a stack of planks, in fact, were burnt. So what happens? Our hypothesis is that the fire was set voluntarily to the boats at the beginning of the 12th dynasty, perhaps by some nomads living between South Palestine, Sinai, and the Western Desert. We could imagine that they wanted to plunder the site and to prevent the Egyptians to sail to the other side. So that's one of the best way to stop them. And the strength of the fire, consequently the very high heat inside of the galleries, led to the collapse of the ceiling of the planks. This in turn extinguished the fire, hence stopping the burning of the planks on ropes and allowing their preservation in the form of this huge coals. And in fact, this fire is a chance for the archaeologists, because this is the only reason why all these wood pieces are sort of preserved. Wood, particularly cedar wood, and it was cedar wood coming from Lebanon, was particularly valuable as Egypt didn't possess lots of wood and certainly not big enough trees to build big boats. So the planks, even when not suitable anymore to be used in a boat, were reused over and over and over again. That's why on sites like Mersagawasis or Wadi El Jarf, you find some reused pieces, but never stacks and stacks of planks, as in Ayn Soukhna galleries. So these dismantled and charred boats represent a unique chance to study pharaonic seagoing ships. These charred remains were studied by Patrice Pommet, specialist of maritime archaeology, of ancient boats and naval architecture, who sadly passed away earlier this year. And I would like to take this opportunity to pay tribute to Patrice, who was a great scholar and a man of incredible generosity. Of course, we're very sad. And he studied these boats, and the result of the study I will just summarize very briefly. So we have parallel rows of cedar planks for boats between 14 and 50 meter longs, hulks plans for most of them. And so the boats were disassembled and stored in this gallery. It's not the entire boats, but the disassembled boats. And maybe the pieces were stored in stacks, depending on their function on the boats. We have oars, ropes, fastening elements. There was wedge stones and logs, as well as mats to insulate the planks from the dampness of the grounds, rope of coals, mats also over the planks to protect them. And we have a lot of information. You can see the charred ropes from Gallery J2 in here. We have information about the fastening techniques from these pieces. You can see some of the pieces who can be restored. And so what were the fastening techniques? Simple and double mortise and tenons, and ropes for the stitch boat techniques. So definitely we have reinforced fastening techniques for seagoing vessels, because we have just simple mortise and tenons and ropes for the Nile going ships. So that's one of the results. And Patrice summarized those with these 14 to 15 meter boats, and he qualifies them as respectable size and quite sufficient to cross the Gulf of Suez to Sinai Peninsula and return with a cargo of ore weighing several tons. And we have a few anchors, stone anchors too. We found 2 of them this year, 2 more, and sometimes they were reused in the constructions of walls too. So that's a settlement during the Middle Kingdom. You can see it here. So it's early Middle Kingdom only, because we just have early Middle Kingdom on the settlement on the lower part of the site. And it's, as you can see, it's bigger than the Old Kingdom settlements. It's really larger, an open settlement with some building islands and space free of buildings in between. So we have 3 or 4 phases for the beginning of the Middle Kingdom in a span of 50 years between Montuet IV and Senusrites I. So again, storehouses, dwellings, cooking areas, baking facilities. But what explains best the developments of the settlements in the early Middle Kingdom is a change in the pattern of the copper system in the Red Sea. During the Old Kingdoms, the first phases of transformation of the copper ore were near the mines in South Sinai. During this brief phase in the early Middle Kingdom, for a reason we ignore, they chose to move this first phase to Ayn Soukhna. So we have lots of copper workshops to the redux of copper ore. So we now have more than 75 redux furnaces in Ayn Soukhna. So that's why it's a very, very important issue for the excavation of the site. And we have a specialist, Georges Verly, of archaeometallurgy, working a lot with the structures, and he was able to reconstruct all the chaîne opératoire of copper in Ayn Soukhna. with experimental archaeology too. I can show you, for instance, yeah, this is one of the copper workshop, and crucibles retrieved there, as well as some tools from time to time, and blowing pipes. And this is one of the 3D reconstructions of a copper furnace that George Verly made, and you can see the experimental archaeology going on there for with this kind of redox furnace. Yeah, so what we are working with too, I just will finish with that, is the organization and the daily life, and how they were provided with supplies from the Nile Valley. Obviously, all the supplies is coming from the Nile Valley. We have specific type of ceramics made for these expeditions, with different type of marks for the different part of the team. So they were given cereals, and they have to transform that into bread and beer in order to eat on site. They can living cattle too. So we have now a pretty good idea of the manner in which they lived on the site. Yeah, so big chain of supplies from Memphis. And I will stop with that, just to say that we are now near the end of the excavation of the site, but we still are making really very nice discoveries. For instance, this year I found lots of steel impressions from the Old Kingdom layers, and on some of these steel impressions we had Horus name of Uzerkaf, first king of the 5th dynasty, and that's the first because we didn't have any attestation that Uzerkaf ordered an expeditions to South Sinai. So it's a new expeditions to add to the list of Egyptian expeditions to South Sinai during the Old Kingdom. So every year we have lots of surprise, and we can add to the history of the pharaonic network in the Red Sea. So I finish with these footprints of a man and 2 dogs from the early Middle Kingdom on the site, and of course with the actual and modern team working on the site. That's photos from the end of this year excavation, with the wonderful team of excavators from Luxor working with us on the site, very, very skilled archaeologists. And so we're working together in order to understand better this site of Ayn Soukhna. So thank you very much for your attention. It was a bit longer than planned, I think. And of course, if you have some questions, I'm just there to answer.
Thank you, Claire. Brilliant. Don't worry about going over a few minutes. It doesn't matter at all. Are those footprints in wet clay, and then the clay's just dried?
Yeah, it was in wet clay at the moment they were made. I think there was a rain of some sort, because it happens from time to time, and so yeah, it just walked on the wet clay, and it dried very quickly afterwards, and sand come with the wind, and it was just buried, and we retrieved it just like that. So it was a very emotional moment.
That's astonishing to have. You can see the toes and everything. I can see one set of dog footprints, but I can't see the second set of dog footprints.
Yeah, it's more faint. It's in this part, and yeah, so yeah.
Oh, that's that must have been quite a day. To was that sort of just brushing away the sand, and then there it was?
Yeah.
Wow. Excellent. Let's see if we have any questions from the audience or not. So there's the question pane, the question panel, please, in the GoToMeeting viewer. So you should just be able to type in a question if you have one for Claire. I'm going to say, how deep is it from inscriptions? Maybe I'm answering my own question here, but I'm going to ask the question. How do you know there were no women? How do you know it was all men?
we know that from the inscriptions, because we have sort of lists of people coming, yeah, so only men are mentioned in those inscriptions. It's always guys, so carpenters, sailors, warriors, overseers of troops, and in troops we have just men. So that we know that from other sources. So no traces of women in these expeditions.
And is the timing of it linked to weather? Is it wind?
We do think so. We think it's linked to the sailing conditions in the northern Gulf of Suez. So it's during spring and the beginning of summer, maybe between April, May, June, and July, something like that. And we know that too from the dates on some of the inscriptions in South Sinai and in Ayn Soukhna.
Okay, yeah. So you need the right wind conditions because you're making crossings backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. Yeah. From the same locations, from the mining sites back to the harbour, back to the mining sites, and you need to be able to do that in both directions. So you, yeah, you definitely need the right. I've got more. If no one else has got questions. Oh yeah, okay. Is it known how the sailors navigated across? I mean, it was, what do you say, 55 nautical miles?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. So Patrice thought it was like 14 to 18 hours to go there, maybe a bit more to come back, something like that.
So in terms of navigation, that would have been using presumably the sun, the stars, using the landmarks, using, you know, keeping one bit of land behind you. And
yeah, and in fact, when you're navigating in the Gulf of Suez, the other side is always visible. In good weather condition. From Ayn Soukhna, we can see the Sinai, so the coast of Sinai. So it's always there. You can always see the coast of Sinai.
Ah, okay. So as long as you've got visibility, as long as you haven't got mist or fog or anything, you should be able to see from one end to the other. Okay, we've got a question from David. Did the furnaces create copper ingots? And if so, do we know size and weight?
So that's something George and his team are working on now. They are producing copper pills, and so in one grave on the site, we did not have a lot of them, but in one of them we found a sort of a little bag in leather with copper pills inside. So that's one of the form that can take copper when coming out of the redox furnaces. So they can export copper pills, but they can export to ingots, and yeah, there is some indication that there can be ingots too, but we just have one mold, and so it's difficult to be certain of the size and the weight of this features. So we don't exactly know for now.
Linked to the furnaces, Arthur asks about where the wood came from to provide the charcoal for the furnaces.
Yeah, that's another feature too. Georges Verlier and Frédéric Rademakers, working on the site, just published a paper about the fuel for the redox furnaces. So I'm just quoting their research. So it was green wood from acacia, we think, and donkey dung mixed in the furnaces.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe the wood came from the little oasis near the spring. We know that there is some acacia in the desert wadis, and maybe they came with some wood from the valley. We don't exactly know, but they used not charcoal but fresh wood in the furnaces.
Okay, so a decision has been made to do the reduction there rather than wherever it was being done before, because presumably the ore was being transported back somewhere else before.
Yeah,
Okay.
definitely. There is thousands of furnaces near the mines in Sinai from the Old Kingdom. And yeah, they decided to change the chaîne opératoire at some point during the Middle Kingdom. It's a brief time during early Middle Kingdom. It's a few expeditions on a span of time of maybe 40, 50 years. And maybe they just exploited the fuel from the oasis for a brief time. I don't know why they showed that exactly, but yeah, that's change of pattern for a brief period.
Okay, we've got a question from Claire asking about, I think this is about the sort of the land journey that would have in order to get to Ayn Soukhna, and whether or not it was dangerous, was it risky, is there any records or evidence of people dying on route, or even, I suppose, whilst they're there?
We don't have text about people dying en route, but we know of some of the dangers of trips in the deserts. For instance, scorpions and snakes. And for instance, in some of the expeditions, you have the mention of scorpion repellers. So one of the guys in the expedition was specialist, maybe about scorpions and snakes. Bites, I don't know, but we have one inscription in Ayn Soukhna mentioning from the reign of Amenemhat III at the end of the 12th dynasty, one of the scorpion repeller. So that was definitely one of the danger of trips in the desert.
I love that job title. Oh, you get paid danger money for being a scorpion repeller. That's amazing. Faye is curious about the family portrait and were there other ones found from other families in other similar sites. I know you mentioned the same one was found over elsewhere, but are there any others, or is it just that one family?
No, it's just that one family, because
Wow.
this inscription in South Sinai was striking when it was found a long time ago. And okay, it's strange as there is a representation of a family there. It's not usual in inscriptions from officials and dignitaries in mining areas or in the desert. And when we found the stela, it's okay, that's the same guy with his family again. So that makes sense.
Yeah, it's brilliant. I wonder what bad things he did to have to make it up to his wife to include her on this.
I don't know.
It's like, but I got you a card. Look, I made this for you. Okay, let's see what we've got. Arthur's asked lots of questions about the charcoal and the furnaces, but I think we've answered those questions already. Arthur, or going back to the Stella, she wonders whether, or Faye wonders whether or not that the wife had something to do with it, had some sort of relationship to the project, to the expedition. But we don't know that, do we? I suppose.
No, we have a title for her in this new stela, because there was no title, just a name in the Sinai inscription. So, but the title is not related to the expedition, so we have no means to link her except by the presence of her husband in the expedition.
Okay, I'm wondering about these boat pits and about what it actually. You had two examples. One is more funerary related. You said, I think.
It's not, no, it's practical, but we have the only parallels we have are on funerary context near the pyramids in the Memphis area. But those we have are not at all funerary related. That's what's exceptional with that feature in Ayn Soukhna. One of them is clearly linked to reassemble and working with the boat. Of course, the one found by Gregory Marois a few years ago in Comforting area. The other one that I found a few years ago, yeah, the link with the harbour facilities is with a question mark, obviously,
Yeah.
but I cannot imagine another function for that except for linking that with boat activities. So that's why.
Yeah, we need a boat expert. If only Patrice was still with us.
Definitely.
Because I wonder, it's you said the geomorphology study suggested that actually the landscape hasn't changed greatly,
Yeah.
but what about sea level rise, or is the coast pretty much where the coast was, that sort of water land interface?
Yeah, pretty much. It's not very different. So we can say that yeah, the shore was at about the same place during the pharaonic period as it is now.
So how far away is the boat pit from the shore? How far away if it is for reconstructing boats, they've then got to transport those boats from that location to the water. And presumably, if they're able to carry several tons of ore, they're pretty heavy boats.
It's 200 meters, so it's not
200
very far.
meters. Well, I don't try to move something 200 meters sounds like quite a long way to me.
I would think that just disload the boat before, transport it to there. And maybe it was used more to reassemble it when they just came with the planks after crossing the desert, or after extracting the planks from the galleries when there was some of them just stored in the galleries in between two expeditions. I don't know.
Yeah, there's a great bit of experimental archaeology to be done.
Yes, definitely.
alongside the experimental people doing the furnaces is where somebody could try to reassemble a boat. Okay, we've got
This has lots of questions about this boat pit, because he saw this boat pit and it had lots of questions. It's a sort of unique feature, so it's always difficult to work with that.
yeah, definitely. And as a nautical archaeological society, that's what sort of fascinates me, is how I can get the part that the parts are taken, transported, and A goes to B and B joins to C and C joins to D, and people know how, they understand how to rebuild them, but the exact process and where you choose to do that, and how you then get them into the water, and then likewise at the end of the expedition, how you do that in reverse, how you beach the boat, presumably. It's emptied, it's lightened as light as it could possibly be, and is dragged up the beach, disassembled in parts, and then perhaps moved a little bit further, and then disassembled and moved a little bit further, and then presumably in the galleries there's a system whereby longer bits go in certain ones.
Excuse me, I didn't hear you.
I would imagine that certain parts are going in certain galleries, so that it's known what's going in which gallery. Put that in gallery 1, that's going in gallery 2.
Yeah, maybe. And we have this hypothesis that there is certain durability of the function of the galleries in time, and maybe that's not a surprise that the remains of the boats from the beginning of the Middle Kingdoms are in galleries that are outside of this
Oh, I've lost
building.
you. I've lost you. No, you're back. Sorry, you're back.
Guarding the entrance of the galleries, because it will be.
Oh, sorry, I don't know whether everyone else has lost Claire. Claire's doing this on her 4G, which is very impressive, on her mobile network, but I seem